This lecture is about the brain. The brain has four major regions: the cerebral hemispheres, or the cerebrum, the diencephalon, the brainstem, and the cerebellum. In a typical adult brain, you can see that the cerebral hemisphere is most of this region of the brain. The diencephalon is between the two hemispheres of the brain, and it's there. The cerebellum is towards the back, kind of near the occipital region, and then the brain stem is here and it connects to the spinal cord. First, we'll talk about the cerebrum. So the cerebral hemispheres are paired, so you've got a left and a right side, and they're kind of the superior parts of the brain. They're on top. They include more than half of the mass of the brain, and they have kind of that ridged surface, and the ridges are called the gyri, and the grooves are called sulci. So those are the depressions between the ridges. If you were to look at a cross section, the gyri would be these ridges, the sulci or sulcus would be these divisions or folds, and if it's a really deep sulcus, it's called a fissure. Again, those deep grooves are called fissures, and they divide the cerebrum into lobes. The surface lobes of the cerebrum include the frontal lobe, the parietal lobe, the occipital lobe, and the temporal lobe, and they're located roughly where the bones of the same names are. The cerebrum has a lot of specialized areas. So there's areas that do somatic sensory, and so they receive impulses from the body's sense organs. They are located in the parietal lobe. There's also the primary motor area that sends impulses to skeletal muscle. That's located in the frontal lobe. And there's another region called Broca's area, and that's involved in our ability to speak. So this diagram gives an outline of kind of where the major functions of our body are located on the brain. So like here we have the primary motor area. This is Broca's area where speech is located. There's primary somatic sensory. Gustatory is the ability to taste. Speech and language is where that dashed area is. So all of these different areas are located in that frontal lobe or in the cerebrum. This diagram kind of gives an anterior to posterior region of kind of sensory and function. So you can see major things like swallowing, and then like things on your face where that's integrated. It's also found on the other side. So all of these different functions and areas of your body are kind of located across different regions of the cerebrum. Your special senses are housed in the cerebrum, so that's gustatory, which is taste, visual, auditory, and olfactory. Interpretation areas include the speech and language area, language comprehension, and general interpretation. So language involves both interpretation and then also production of language, and then control of the muscles to produce speech. So you could potentially have language comprehension and not have speech, because those are controlled by different parts of the brain. So we'll just go look at this diagram one more time. So again, you have like language comprehension, which is in a different area than speech. So those two different regions have two different parts of your ability to communicate. The cerebrum is made up of a few layers. There's the gray matter, and that's the outer layer, and it's composed mostly of the neuron cell bodies. And then the white matter is the fiber tracts, and that's deep to the gray matter, so it's beneath the gray matter. And then there's a structure called the corpus callosum, and that connects the right and left halves to one another so they can communicate with each other. And then there's also another structure called the basal nuclei, and these are just little islands of gray matter that are buried within the white matter. So in this diagram, you can see the gray matter is on the outside of the brain, the white matter is deeper, and you can see the two halves of the brain are connected by this structure, which is the corpus callosum. And then you can see also those basal nuclei that are located in the brain here. Next, we'll talk about the diencephalon. It sits on top of the brainstem. It's enclosed by the cerebral hemisphere, so it sort of sits in between the right and left side. And it's made of three parts: the thalamus, the hypothalamus, and the epithalamus. So in this diagram, you can see kind of where the diencephalon sits. It's this section of the brain that's sort of outlined in purple. So here you can see where the hypothalamus is located, where the thalamus is located, and then the epithalamus is this tissue that sits on top, hence the name epithalamus. So that diencephalon region is responsible for relaying things like special sense information to your cerebrum. And in this diagram, you can see a bunch of information is sent there first. So like visual impulses are one of those things. Audio impulses are another one. The function of the thalamus specifically, it's surrounded by the third ventricle, and it's the relay station for sensory impulses. It transfers impulses to the correct part of the cortex for localization and interpretation. So the thalamus is kind of a signal director, and it sends information to the correct part of the brain. The hypothalamus is under the thalamus, which is why it's called hypothalamus. It's important in the autonomic nervous system center. So it helps to regulate things like body temperature, your water balance, and metabolism. It also is kind of the housing for the limbic center, which is where the seat of emotions is, and it regulates the nearby pituitary gland, which is a pretty important gland, and we will talk about that in the future when we talk about the endocrine system. And it also produces 2 hormones of its own. The epithalamus is the roof of the third ventricle, so it houses the pineal gland, which is another endocrine gland, and it also includes the choroid plexus, which is what forms cerebrospinal fluid, which is the liquid that bathes the brain and spinal cord within the skull and spinal cavity. The next part of the brain we'll talk about is the brain stem. This attaches to the spinal cord, and it's made up of the midbrain, the pons, and the medulla oblongata. So in this diagram, you can see the brain stem. So the cerebral pentacle of the midbrain is here, and then the pons is here, and the medulla oblongata is here, and that's what is directly adjacent to the spinal cord. That division is kind of right there. The midbrain is mostly composed of tracts of nerve fibers, but it has 2 bulging fiber tracts, and those are called cerebral pendicles. It has 4 rounded protrusions also, and those are called the corpora quadrigemina. And these are reflex sensors for vision and hearing. So if someone were to like throw a basketball at your face, you'd probably blink, and that is a reflex, that is a visual reflex that could be processed here. The pons is the bulging center part of the midbrain. Also, it's mostly composed of fiber tracts, and it includes the nuclei that are involved in the control of breathing. So it's one of those basic life functions that's pretty low on the brainstem, and it's something that just is continually occurring. And then the medulla oblongata is the lowest part of the brainstem. It's where it merges into the spinal cord. It also includes important fiber tracts. These are all just big nerve bundles, and it contains important control centers for heart regulation, for blood pressure regulation, breathing, swallowing, and vomiting. So those are some of the major controls of the medulla oblongata. The brainstem also has a structure called the reticular formation. It's a diffuse mass of gray matter that's along the brainstem. It is involved with motor control of visceral organs. So those are things that are in your abdominal cavity, especially like intestines, liver, things like that. And then there's also the reticular activation system. This allows you to have awake-sleep cycles and your consciousness, so it's kind of your circadian rhythms. Next, we'll talk about the cerebellum. It has 2 hemispheres with convoluted surfaces, meaning that it's bumpy or ridged, and it provides involuntary control of body or coordination of body movements. The cerebellum is located down kind of in the occipital, underneath the occipital region of the cerebrum. Scientists think that it helps to smooth muscle movements so that you have coordinated and smooth movement rather than jerky movement. Last, we'll talk about what happens if you have injury or damage to the brain. So there's a few different types of traumatic brain injuries. A concussion is a very slight brain injury. There's no permanent brain damage. A contusion is when the nervous tissue destruction occurs. Nervous tissue does not regenerate, and so this can actually kill off certain neurological tissue. And then a cerebral edema is when you have swelling from an inflammatory response. If the swelling is bad enough, it can compress and kill brain tissue. Someone with cerebral edema, or water on the brain as it's called sometimes, might have a hole drilled in their skull to relieve some of that pressure so that the brain tissue is not damaged. Another way that the brain can be harmed is through a cerebrovascular accident. Sometimes these are also called strokes. These result from a ruptured blood vessel that supplies a region of the brain. The brain tissue that is supplied with oxygen from that specific blood source can die. Loss of function or death can result. Hemiplegia is when you have one-sided paralysis. Aphasis damage is damage to the speech center in the left hemisphere. And there's also a transischemia attack, which is a temporary brain ischemia. And it's when you have restricted blood flow. So the TIAs are small things that are a warning sign for a more serious CVA, which can lead to a stroke or something like that. And then another thing that can affect brain tissue is something like Alzheimer's disease. Alzheimer's disease is a progressive degenerative brain disease. It's a form of dementia. It's mostly seen in elderly but can begin in middle age, and it occurs when structural changes in the brain include abnormal protein deposits and twisted fibers within the neurons. And so people with Alzheimer's can end up with memory loss, irritability, confusion, hallucinations, and then it is ultimately a fatal disease.